Okay, so people have seen this, I think, already, and probably the next slide as well.
Okay.
So I think I won't have to spend any time on the first couple of slides really, except to set the stage. We know that environmental damage is largely anthropogenic, and not everything, of course, but a lot of it is, so click. And pollution, click. And overfishing, 85% of the world's fisheries. These are pine beetle devastations in northern British Columbia. So we know there's problems out there, click. And we know that it's going to be serious. This is I like this slide because it shows that climate change is not just a matter of temperature rising, not just a matter of flooding or storm surges, but it's going to affect health. And what particularly bothers me is the potential for social strife as people try to migrate from places that are already heavily impacted. So it's everything from, yeah, a storm surge or a little bit of temperature rise to, you know, people fighting each other. So it's serious. And click. And this was Barack Obama's statement 5 years ago about it being serious. And what impresses me about this is that the president, at least that president, had, you know, every kind of problem on his desk, and said that this is the most important problem, the most urgent and growing threat of any of his problems that he sees for this century. So click. So there are some sort of macro causes of climate change problems, geophysical things. Some of us live in cold climates, some in hot. We still live in a pretty much grow or die capitalist system. We are so tempted by the technology around us, and it's climate intensive. We still have infrastructure problems that make it hard to be a good citizen climate-wise. And one thing I learned in developing a program here called the Human Dimensions of Climate Change is how difficult it can be to get legislation passed, not necessarily on a left-right basis, but just the mechanics of that. So there are some problems beyond what I'm going to talk about mostly, which is on the next slide. I think that ultimately it's all about us, from whether we're average citizens, people who are working on this problem, or even a CEO. We are collectively, individually, where the emissions really come from ultimately. Click. So each day we make choices, or we make what you might call non-choices out of habit. These choices matter as we add up across the 7.7 billion people. Some people say, well, it's the government, but really, when you think about it, we're the people who elect governments, and as you can see in the States, in Canada, and other places, government leads by following us for the most part. So it's, again, our vote. People say it's industry. Well, yes and no. In Canada, the big example might be BlackBerry, which just didn't provide the right kind of smartphone, and it died. So industry depends on our purchase choices as well. It's about us. So as one of my colleagues says, there are no environmental problems, trying to be a little bit shocking. There are no environmental problems, there's only human problems. So we're not managing our emissions well enough collectively yet. Some of us are doing better. I'll be talking about that later. The question is, why not? Why aren't we doing such a good job? So this is a general model that I use to guide all my thinking. I'm not going to go through it in great detail. The center of it, of course, is the fact that we make choices. Those choices, yes, are influenced by other people, by the technology around us, by what kind of government we have, where we live, by education. But our choices have impacts on ourselves. Positive. We try to make choices that are positive, but the side choices are that it affects the rest of the environment and then society in general as following that. So my current thinking on a more abstract level or theoretical level, which we try to do here in academia, is to kind of simplify this into a model that can make sense, can help to predict behavior and understand it. So this theory of behavioral choice says, the center of it says that we have good intentions often, but they don't lead to doing the right thing. So why not? Well, first of all, because we have structural barriers. We can't really take the bus in a small town if there's no bus system, or if we're physically disabled. On the other hand, we have psychological barriers. That's a polite term for reasons that we give for not doing the right thing. Of course, on the left side, our intentions are influenced also by the kind of values and principles we have, by the other people around us, and whether we simply want to create such an intention. This theory is described in the article below if you want to follow that up. So as I look at it, information is valuable for priming people, getting people ready to make a change. Persuasion helps, please help, incentives, even believing that I want to do the right thing, still don't lead from those kind of good intentions, information to actually doing the right thing. So why not? That's the central part of this talk is, why doesn't that happen? And of course, what can we do about it? So partly it's because in this 1950s phrase from a short story by Robert Heinlein, prominent science fiction writer, people are not rational animals, they're rationalizing animals. And I like to thank my brother, who is an expert on Robert Heinlein, for supplying this with me, because actually Heinlein said this before a lot of psychologists were talking about it. So anyway, what can we do about it? We know what we can do about it from different websites, like this one is Al Gore's 10 things you can do, 10 or 15 years old now. Or you can look around and find 50 things that you can do if you want. And if you look around further, you can find the 51st thing that you can do. So the information is out there. It's not a big problem for most things. But in some, we just don't do everything that we should, even what some of us think we ought to do. So why not? Well, the answer is these dragons of inaction. And so the dragons of inaction come out of me being asked by journalists that's the same basic question. Why is it that most people are sort of on board with the climate, but things are still getting worse and people aren't changing their behavior? And I had to come up with answers for that. And the genesis of the dragons is journalist questions. So after 8 or 10 years of collecting these things, I've organized them into 7 dragon genera, 38 species. I added one today I'll tell you about a little bit later. And they fall into these 7 categories, basically not thinking well enough about it, having certain ideologies, having certain social influences, having different kinds of investments, not only financial, not trusting or believing in authorities or scientists, kind of risks, and limited behavior sorts of things. There's the citation to the article that started all this at the bottom there, and the Dragons of Inaction has a website in case you're interested. It's down there. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on each one of these. I think you'll get the general idea. Limited cognition means that to a certain extent our old original brain was trained to think mainly about the here and now, so that although we certainly can think about the future, a lot of times we just default to what's in front of us right now. And that sometimes is not good for the environment. Sometimes we don't know what to do exactly, how to do it. Sometimes we've just heard the message too often, you should help the environment, and it gets, we just start discounting it like a McDonald's ad. Uncertainty, we've learned in my lab, allows people the latitude to say, well, maybe they're not for sure. Discounting, again, it's like the ancient brain. If it's 2050, 2060, we'll figure it out later. If it's happening in Uruguay or Panama or some Alaska, it's not so important right now. Oh, things will work out just fine. Don't worry about it. oh, who am I? I'm just one person. I can't do much about it, so I'm not going to do anything. I'm sorry, I have to think about money all the time because I live on the edge of poverty, or I'm trying to make $1 billion. I only have $100 million. There's a recent study showing that when people think about money a lot, they do less. And maybe I use the excuse that I can't do it physically, even though I can do it physically. Ideologies, as we all know, there's a kind of a general left-right split here, and one of these ideologies, both of the ideologies include a lot of social issues, but climate change can be seen as one strand that goes in favor or against doing something about it. System justification is sort of, I'm all right, Jack. I don't want to rock the boat. Don't start taxing me. It might affect my lifestyle. Superhuman powers include for some people some form of deity, but also it includes the people who believe that Mother Nature is in control. So therefore, I don't have to do anything because Mother Nature will take care of it, or it's a natural cycle. Or the people who believe that engineers can solve the problem, and so I don't, as a non-engineer, I don't have to do anything. I can just tell you that on my own campus, the green engineers have come across the campus to me and asking me for help, because although they make good technical devices, sometimes they need the help of psychologists to get people to use them or adopt them. We're all, more than we would like to admit, influenced by other people. We compare ourselves to other people. If the people we're comparing ourselves to are not on board with climate, then we might not be. If it's the norm for me to drive a big fancy diesel car, if I think that the other country, the other people aren't doing their share, why should I do it? Sometimes we say we had to do that because my boss told me to do it, or I have to do it for my job, when it's maybe not always true. Because I Can is the new baby dragon that hatched today. It's because I was inspired by a person who told me he's building right now a 10,000 square foot house, just finished a 14,000 square foot house. And why is that person doing that? Well, because I can. And that's probably not the greatest climate rationale. Confirmation bias means that sometimes we pay attention to media sources and others that tell us that we're right. We like to think that we're correct. We like to think we're right. And so if we pay attention to certain media sources, it will tell us that the climate's not that important. A new dragon, a relatively new dragon, is the better than average phenomenon. If you talk to a lot of people and say, what are you doing about the climate? They'll say, well, I probably could do more, but I'm doing more than most people. And the data show that, sorry, that's not true. And but better than average gets me out of having to do more. Sunk costs, I learned from economists, means something you've invested in. It could be finances, it could be oil stocks, royal stocks, but it doesn't have to be. A sunk cost could be behavioral momentum, that is kind of just habit, which is a much stronger influence than a lot of people like to think. It's not very exciting, but we certainly tend to do today what we did yesterday until something happens, till we move to another place, take a different job, change relationships or something like that. Until then, we tend to do things today what we did yesterday. Conflicting goals and aspirations is one of the most important dragons. I call it CGA. It's got its own little acronym. We have legitimate other concerns. We want to take care of our health. We want to take care of our job. If we have children, we want to take care of them. And who's to say that we shouldn't do that? But if we let them include our climate positive actions or exclude those, there's going to be a problem. As my former PhD, Leila Scannell, shows, people who don't have much place attachment have less tendency often to take care of the place around them, which can include not doing climate positive things because I don't care about this place that much. We're all, according to some psychologists, risk aversive, except for, some people who jump off cliffs or whatever, but most of us try to avoid risks. We don't want to take a chance that something won't go right. And so if I do something in favor of the climate, I might get teased. The teasing might get bad enough that I'm bullied. I might lose my investment. What if I put solar panels on the house and then I sell it the next year before I've recovered the benefit from that? What if it doesn't work? Something, I'm not going to do it because I'm not sure if this thing is going to work. What if there's a physical risk like riding a bicycle? Of course, I'm in favor of riding bicycles, but they can be dangerous, so I don't want to take that risk. What if I spend a lot of time figuring out how to do it and then I can't afford it or don't have time to do it and I've wasted time? So I don't want to risk social, psychological, financial, functional, physical, temporal things, so I tend not to take the action that I probably should. Discredence is a fancy word that at the root of it, at the center of it, you see that the core of it is cred, which means credibility. So maybe I don't think that the incentive that you're offering is enough for me to make that change. Maybe I don't trust the government. Maybe I'm full of reactance, which is, I call it the 2-year-old dragon. That is, you can't make me do it. In fact, if you tell me to do it, I'm going to go and buy a Hummer just to show you. There are people who are described as having contrarian personalities. They're against climate change, but they're also against pretty much everything else in life. You've probably met somebody like that. The denialists are now down to single digits in most places. On the other hand, what we have is the rise of what I call neo-denialists. The neo-denialist says, oh, okay, yes, I think something's happening, but it's just not very important, so I'm not going to do anything. The last of the genera is limited behavior. That is tokenism. I like to say, I recycle, so I guess I've done my part. And of course, it's not really enough just to recycle, even though that's a good thing. The rebound effect, or the Jevons paradox, is when we reward ourselves in a way that costs more in terms of carbon than the good thing I did. So, honey, I bought a Prius. I live in San Francisco. Let's drive to New York, would be the classic rebound effect. I should mention the good work of Karine Lacroix, who has now, with a lot of work from Angel Chen and myself, created a scale for measuring the dragons. So if you're in the business of actually trying to figure out who has which kind of dragons, to what extent, this scale can be used for that. So, okay, that's the problem. So what can we do about it? How can we slay these dragons? What can we do? I think behavioral scientists have about 7 tools or solutions that we can use to help. The first one is, hey, we need to understand better understand impactful behaviors, and you'll see here that there's quite a lot of ways that can be done. First, we're still not exactly sure what people do. We know in laboratories or small surveys, but what do most people do? We need to measure more about which behaviors are engaged in by which people. Which are the most impactful choices? There's still some debate about whether you should wash your dishes by hand or put them in a dishwasher, and many other choices. Which dragons are more important for which groups? Which behaviors or choices are the easiest ones to overcome, the kind of low-hanging fruit, and which ones are just not going to change? There's no point probably in trying to put effort into those. What about the variations in the rates of the most important behaviors? And what causes them? So this is a kind of I admit, a very ambitious laundry list of things that we can do. Click there. But we really have to do it, or we're not going to get anywhere. We don't want to put resources where, for example, somebody's simply not going to change that behavior. So move ahead. The second thing we can do is a better job, a more expansive job of developing interventions and evaluating them. Right now, just for example, I know of about 22 different messaging strategies that people are using in environmental psychology to try to see which ones work better for which kind of person, which demographic slice. And then sometimes interventions are undertaken without any evaluation. And without evaluating, we don't know how we've done. So we need to both develop interventions and evaluate them. Every environmental psychologist will tell you that we all have to work together. Engineers won't do it by themselves. Architects and urban planners, you're not going to do it yourself. Policy analysts have an important role, not going to do it without evidence. So we have to sit around the table with other engaged professionals who have different skill sets and all work together. The next one is, a lot of people think that climate change is just really not here. I mean, I look out my window right at this moment, I don't see climate change out there. It's a bit of a rainy day here. People walking around, there's no climate change. What you see below, as I said earlier, is the pine beetle devastation in British Columbia, also into the northwest part of the US. When people see it in front of them, in their backyard, on their street, in their ponds and lakes and rivers, that's when people wake up. And so because climate change is happening and is pretty often visible if you know where to look, we need to make environment now, wherever we are working, help to diffuse that information to people in the community, facilitate people who are monitoring, say, bird migrations or plants changing, develop social networks to diffuse and make these things much more available so that people get the idea, hey, climate change is happening right here in River City. Next one is a kind of a personal thing. I always tell people, and I try to do it myself, if you're not at the table, you're not going to be in the policy. So we all should not just do our research or our consulting or our government work or our utility work. We should also be in the actual policy development process. And for example, I'm not interested in running for office, but and maybe you aren't, but everybody can do something within the organization to advance that organization, or in the neighborhood, or maybe even at the municipal or regional level. Everybody should find their own comfort level and do something at the level that they're most comfortable at engaging in. Number 6, this is one that is relatively unknown, I think, in there, is that there are people who are doing all these things that they humanly are capable of. They've slayed most of their personal dragons, but what we don't do enough, in my view, is to reward those people. Reward can be just recognition, or it can be a tax break, or it can be some other thing that person would value. Mules have a kind of bad reputation for being stubborn and whatever, but as in this picture, mules are the people who are carrying the heavy load in terms of carbon and climate, and they should be rewarded more than they are. And 7th, the other part that's sometimes overlooked in this business is the honeybees. Real honeybees are not pollinating trees and flowers and plants for human benefit. They're doing it for their own total self-interest. And one of my colleagues in Germany has estimated that most pro-climate behavior is not actually done by people who are doing it for climate change principles, but really for their own interests. Just cycling mainly for health as a climate denier. I'm only insulating to save money. I don't care about the climate. I'm going to get into mindfulness or yoga or become a monk, or I've chosen not to have a child. And the people doing this may not have any climate interest, but they are doing the right actual behavior, and it's behavior that ultimately counts more than just my attitude or my intention. So, click. We should also find ways to reward honeybees, even if they're not on board with the climate wagon. Give them something to keep on cycling, keep on insulating, and that's it. So in sum, to accelerate climate behavior positive. I think it's a kind of a Rubik's Cube that we have to engage in more research, more support, more. That is, figure out that there are different kinds of people out there. They have different actions and behaviors. Whoops. And can you go back? And they all have different kinds of dragons. And so you have this kind of Rubik's Cube of that we need to solve collectively. So my take-home message is any kindergartner can get this. Climate change action equals mules plus honeybees minus dragons. So thank you for listening. I'm here if you want to talk, ask questions. My contact information is there. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks, Bob. I really appreciate that presentation. I think it was very succinct and really interesting. And Maxine's been diligently collecting all of your questions. If you have any other questions, please put them into the chat box now. And we'll just ask you a few rapid fire style, and you can answer as they come.
Okay, so one question I have here, this is a comment question. I think the frontier is integrating some of these personal behavior choices with the social structure constraints. I work in the intersection of climate, public policy, and public-private finance. What are your views on addressing this intersection?
Well, I'm a kind of, I never had to answer that question before, but I'm doing this off the top of my head, and I'm going to take a kind of radical individualist perspective and say a social structure is really just a whole bunch of individuals, actually. So if you say there's social pressure, social structure that's halting me or halting somebody, well, that social structure is really just other individuals. And so it's our job, I think, to do what we can to influence the other people, other individuals, one-on-one, one at a time if necessary, so that the social structure changes and then becomes a kind of tipping point, so that the people who are still resistant find that the new social structure is one that requires me to do something. I think a good example, at least where I live, is blue box recycling. Once you start to see that almost everybody else is recycling and has a blue box out there, you feel a lot of pressure to do it. But before there was blue box recycling, there wasn't that kind of social pressure. So it sort of gradually changed, almost like a trend. And that's what we have to do, is remember that the social structure really is made up of just a whole bunch of other individual people.
Okay, and then there's a couple of questions on this point that you made. Can you talk more about the 22 different types of messaging strategies? Where can we access the resources for them? What do they entail? And how are they disseminated? And how can we effectively use them to communicate positive behaviors to the quote-unquote honeybees without seeming preachy?
Yeah, if somebody's interested in them, one thing is to email me, and I can go into much more detail than I have time now. But one that we've used in our own research and shown to be effective is the difference between embedding a message that talks about sacrifice versus empowerment, for example. And so if you write a message that speaks to doing the right thing is an empowering, positive thing for your community, your children, your community, you will get much more uptake than if you say, climate change is here, we're all going to have to sacrifice. Another such one of these pairings, all these 22 are pairings between A versus B. A local message usually is going to work better than a global message. Putting it in overly dramatic terms, and it's not exactly true. Nobody really cares about polar bears, but they do care about something happening in their backyard. But there's 20 more of them, so email me if you're interested.
And then another question, what kind of information would be the most helpful to share from an energy efficiency program administrator perspective to build on this body of research?
Yeah, my ultimate answer to that is the same one that I give for many other similar questions. What's underneath this question is that there is some single silver bullet message, and the answer is this does not exist. So that's why that Rubik's Cube is there. That is to get people to upgrade their energy efficiency in their household. It's going to be different kinds of messages for different kinds of people. And although some people are working on this issue, like Reuven is and some other people, we need to learn more about which messages apply to different people. And so I hope you don't think I'm copying out, but really there is not a single best message for everybody. Some people care more about their grandchildren if they're grandparents. Some people care more about privacy, etc. So we have to do a better job of crafting messages that are suitable to different kinds of people.
Okay, another question. For the mules and honeybees, what sort of rewards work? Say if you're not an organization and you can't offer things like tax breaks.
Yeah, again, again, I'm just going to repeat, but it's because I believe in it. So different mules probably have different desires. What if it's a fairly well-off person but doing everything possible? Then maybe a monetary reward is not as important to that person as some sort of recognition in the local newspaper or something. On the other hand, you have some people who have very few resources themselves, but they're living this monastic life to save the climate. Maybe that person should get an out-and-out direct money. Somebody in the middle might favor having a tax break. So once again, it's sort of what kind of mule are we talking about here? But where I would be consistent and say is we really should be rewarding these people in a way that's appropriate for them or desirable or attractive to the different kinds of mules.
Okay, another question here. How do you think we can influence governments and elected representatives to make climate change a priority?
Yeah, I mean, it's just the old story of any kind of social change, and that is writing letters, going in the streets, going to council meetings, joining political campaigns. Nothing is really going to happen until more people get on board. Not just, I like to say attitudes don't change anything, which is true. What changes is action that you're capable or feel comfortable with, whether it's anything from writing a letter to joining a committee, joining a party, going in the street if necessary, etc. So that's how governments change. I like to, some people think government is leading, and I like to say governments usually follow.
Okay, another question. You referred to a lot of great psychological research. How can practitioners and program administrators connect to the research? How do we share feedback and results?
Yeah, that's a great question because people. I try to connect with people in my provincial government here, and we're in contact. And I think that the kind of obvious answer is have meetings. Government people are forced to think a little differently than academics are, and so there has to be a bit of back and forth to find the common ground. But too many academics stay in the tower, and maybe too many government people stay in their offices. But the obvious answer to that is get together, figure out how the research can be translated. The government people tend to be better at thinking about how to actually translate it. Academics try, but often we get a bit lost in the models and whatever. But I think the two sitting across from each other at a table with good faith can do a lot.
Can I just jump in? to give a little plug to the BECC conference, which is an excellent place for academics, governments, businesses, and nonprofits to meet up and exchange this kind of knowledge.
Another question, how do you identify the right interventions for the different types of dragons?
Yeah, that's a good question. And the way we're doing it here in my lab, which has 6 or 7 grad students and employees and whatever, is basically you can have a good idea about how to do it, but the only way to know is to try it out. And so we try different messages with different people. We try to interact with not just students on campus, but also we do surveys with people in the community. And so I think this is the main idea, is to try out different things and see what works. And then, you know, for example, we found that sacrifice messages just don't work as well as empowering messages. Well, okay, at least for some people, we need maybe everyone or maybe almost everybody. On the other hand, there probably are at least a few people who resonate more to the sacrifice message, but as a group, we found that empowerment messages work better, but not necessarily for everybody.
Let's see here. Sorry, we have several questions coming in here. How might we glean quickly from the marketing sector the lessons about messaging?
I'm sorry, I don't quite get that question.
Oh, sorry, and then a comment. Perhaps that would be a way to accelerate the learning curve?
Well, I don't know if I have any special wisdom about that, except talking to, you know, it depends on who's talking. Is it professors talking, policy people, government people, municipal people? And so for each occupation or just average citizens, all of us have to use the platform that we're given to reach out to the people who are in front of us, whether it's our next door neighbor or our social group or our constituents. And so we all have to be loudspeakers for whichever audience that we have.
Okay, and then I think we'll do one more question. How do you see this field of work tying into the community-based social marketing work by Doug McKenzie?
Well, interesting. You should ask Doug McKenzie more. Is appointed as an adjunct professor in my department, mainly because I ask for it. But certainly there's a huge overlap, of course, between his techniques and methods and whatever, and what we do in my lab. We're a little bit more on the science side, testing hypotheses and trying out things because we have the resources and the mandate to do that. And Doug's goal is really the knowledge transfer and trying to actually instigate action in existing groups in the real world. And so, but there's a huge overlap there.
Bob, I just wanted to say thank you again so much for participating today and doing this webinar. And for everybody online who bore with us through our frustrations and difficulties. Thank you for joining today's webinar, The Dragons of Inaction and How to Slay Them. Within the next day, we will be sending you all a link to the recording of today's event. And just a reminder, the next webinar is on Tuesday, February 25th, not to be missed, by Professor Arlene Burt of Minneapolis College of Art and Design. And again, she'll be talking about how to tell a story with your data in a visual way to make it more compelling. She offered one of our most successful workshops at last year's conference. So if you missed that, you might be interested in this webinar. Be sure to check out the BECC conference and submit your abstracts before April 1st. Just search Behavior, Energy, Climate Change in your Google, or you can go to beccconference.org. Thanks again and have a wonderful day.